The Pharisees prayed more than you do. They fasted more than you do. They knew the scripture better than most pastors alive today. And they completely missed the voice of God standing right in front of them. That should stop you cold, not because you're like the Pharisees in the ways you've been taught to fear, but because the mechanism that blinded them, it doesn't require hypocrisy. It doesn't require pride. It only requires one thing, a spiritual structure so well built that it stops receiving the very signal it was designed for. If you're watching this, there's a good chance you're not a casual believer. You show up, you read, you pray, you serve. You've built something real, a rhythm of faith that holds when things get hard. And somewhere in the middle of all that faithfulness, a quiet question started forming. Not a crisis, not doubt, something more unsettling than either of those. A slow awareness that after all the obedience, after all the discipline, after everything you've done to position yourself to hear God, the signal feels harder to find than it used to be. You've done everything right, so why does His purpose feel further away? What I'm about to walk you through is not a warning for lukewarm Christians. This is specifically for the ones trying hardest, because there's a pattern buried in Scripture, confirmed by how the human mind actually works, that explains why the most committed believers can become the least available to hear what God is actually saying. And if you don't recognize it, you can spend years faithfully building a structure that quietly filters out the very voice it was meant to receive. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just slowly the way a window collects dust, until one day the light comes through and you realize you've been living in shade. This isn't about trying less. It's about understanding what spiritual obedience can accidentally become, and the three postures that prevent it. There's a concept in depth psychology called role identity crystallization. It describes what happens when a person becomes so deeply identified with a role they perform that they gradually lose contact with the self beneath the role. In ordinary life, you see it in the physician who can't stop diagnosing when she's at a dinner table, in the leader who has forgotten how to follow, in the caretaker who genuinely can't answer the question, "What do you want?" because the role has replaced the person who used to have an answer. In spiritual life, the mechanism is identical. When your faith becomes primarily defined by what you do, prayer, service, fasting, Bible reading, attendance, something begins to happen beneath the surface. You start experiencing God through the architecture of the role. Anything that fits the structure feels like confirmation from Him. Anything that doesn't, the call to rest, the direction that breaks the schedule, the season of silence, the prompting that doesn't match the plan gets processed as interference. Not temptation, not rebellion, just noise. Filtered out quietly, automatically, without you ever consciously choosing to reject it. Your spiritual antenna is pointed in a direction, and the signal is coming from somewhere else. Now here is the part that history has allowed us to flatten into comfort. The Pharisees weren't pretending. Many of them were genuinely devoted. The Pharisees emerged from a movement specifically designed to protect the identity of God's people through rigorous, wholehearted faithfulness to the law. They prayed 3 times daily. They fasted twice weekly. They memorized entire books of Scripture. They gave of the 10th of their herb gardens, things the law didn't even require. And when the Messiah appeared, the very fulfillment of every word they had guarded, their spiritual structure couldn't receive Him. Not because He was obscure. He was teaching in their synagogues, healing in their streets. He was broadcasting clearly, consistently, openly. But their internal receiver was tuned to a frequency the living God had moved beyond. They had built such a comprehensive system for encountering God that when God showed up outside of that system, the system rejected Him. They didn't reject God despite their obedience, they rejected Him through it. The discipline became the filter, the structure became the wall. Which brings us to a woman sitting on the floor. Mary and Martha, you know this story, and you've probably heard it preached as a lesson about rest versus busyness or contemplation versus service. But there's a dimension of what Jesus says here that almost never surfaces. When Jesus tells Martha that Mary has chosen the good portion, the Greek is agathmeris, the best part, the part that cannot be taken away, He is not comparing Mary's spirituality to Martha's lack of it. He loved Martha deeply. He wept with her. He raised her brother. What He is identifying is a posture, not a preference. Martha was available within her structure. She had a role to fill. She had a framework for what honoring God looked like, and she was executing it faithfully. Her availability was real. It was just conditional on the framework. Mary was available to whatever He was actually doing in that room, in that moment, regardless of what it required of her. That is the distinction that the Pharisees lost. That is the distinction that faithful Christians lose quietly over years without noticing, not between the active and the contemplative, between structural availability and radical availability. One opens you to what you've learned to expect from God. The other keeps you open to what He hasn't told you yet. And now the question becomes personal and harder. If the pattern works the way I've described, if your spiritual structure filters signals that don't match the structure, then by definition you wouldn't feel the filtering. You wouldn't experience it as rejection. You'd experience it as patient faithfulness, continued obedience, waiting on God. The closed door wouldn't feel like a closed door. It would feel like holy stillness. In 1 Samuel 3, Samuel hears a voice calling him in the night. He lives in the temple. He has been raised in faithful service since childhood. He knows the forms of encountering God. And 3 times the voice calls, and 3 times he assumes it's coming through the established channel. He runs to Eli because that's where God has always spoken. It wasn't his distance from God that caused him to miss the voice. It was his familiarity with a particular structure of encounter. He needed someone outside his pattern to tell him, go back, listen differently. That is not what you think it is. So what does this actually require of you? The answer is not to stop praying, not to abandon the disciplines, not to dismantle what you've built. The structure is not the enemy. But there are 3 postures that determine whether obedience becomes a window or a wall. The first is what theologians have called kenosis, a periodic unhooking from the role itself, not abandoning your calling, but regularly asking the question the structure itself cannot generate. God, what are you doing that doesn't look like what I'm doing? The Psalms practice this constantly. The psalmist will be deep in liturgical praise and suddenly collapse into raw, unscheduled honesty. My God, why have you forsaken me? The structure was interrupted by presence. That interruption is not failure, it is contact. The second posture is the deliberate suspension of certainty about how God speaks. The most spiritually dangerous sentence a committed Christian can carry is, I know what God's voice sounds like, because the moment that knowing crystallizes, it becomes a filter. God is not bound to your epistemology. He transmits, you calibrate, not the other way around. The third posture, and this is the one that reorders everything, is what Scripture calls received identity rather than performed identity. The Pharisees' self-understanding was bound to their performance. Martha's distress wasn't just logistical, it was existential. If the serving wasn't recognized, something in her sense of standing was threatened. When your identity before God is rooted in grace, in what He has declared over you rather than what you have demonstrated for Him, then the unexpected call doesn't threaten you. The season of silence doesn't destabilize you. The direction that breaks your structure doesn't feel like abandonment. And because none of those things threaten you, you can actually hear them. The structure you've built is not the problem. Prayer is real. Discipline matters. Faithful obedience is one of the most beautiful things a human being can offer to God. But it is a means, not a destination. It is a frequency you tune, not the broadcast itself. And God, in His love, reserves the right to transmit beyond what your current dial can reach, not to punish your faithfulness, to expand it. Mary wasn't less devoted than Martha. She was more available. Not available within a framework, available to Him in that room at that moment, regardless of what that cost her in the eyes of the structure around her. That is what unlocks calling. Samuel grew into one of the great prophets in Israel's history. He became the voice that anointed kings, but he almost missed the night that defined everything because he kept running to the wrong room. He needed Eli to say, go back, be still. And this time when the voice comes, don't assume you already know what it's coming through. If there's a voice that's been reaching for you beneath the schedule, outside the routine, in the margins of the structure you've built so faithfully, this might be the moment someone is saying the same thing to you. Go back, be still, and this time listen for what you don't recognize. If this opens something in you, share it with someone you trust, someone who has been faithful, someone who might be carrying the same quiet question. And if you want to go deeper into the architecture of spiritual identity and calling, stay with this channel. There's more to come.